No one noticed the invisible danger, but a deaf girl's guide dog knew. His ferocious and uncontrollable behavior was their only chance at survival. What would he do when time ran out and the girl couldn't hear his warning? The silence in the cabin was a trap, dense and heavy, broken only by the muffled sound of the wind outside and Max's low, continuous growl. For Sophia, the world was always a place of visual stillness, but that morning the quiet was deeper, more absorbing. She slept a heavy, unshakable sleep, as if anchored to an abyss of darkness and warmth. Max, however, knew no silence. His sharp senses picked up the subtle change in the air, an invisible presence that his primal instinct screamed was dangerous. The smell of burning wood in the fireplace was normal, but there was something else, something that itched in his throat and weighed on his lungs. He growled again, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of his chest, aimed at the empty air that was increasingly becoming an enemy. He tried what he knew. First, gentle nudges with his snout, an invitation to the day. No response. Then, a low whine, almost a lament, followed by a soft scratch on the blanket. Sophia merely stirred, muttering something unintelligible before sinking deeper into the soft mattress. Her muscles were heavy, her mind clouded by a fog that wasn't ordinary sleep. Max's desperation grew with the invisible ticking of time. He jumped onto the bed, his large paws landing with a muffled thud beside Sophia. He nudged her with his snout, then with his head, trying to force her awake. His barks, which in other circumstances would have been a shrill alarm, were now silent to her, just ineffective vibrations against the barrier of her deafness. Max knew his time was running out. He could feel the weakness in his own paws, the dizziness that threatened to fell him. The threat wasn't visible, wasn't palpable, but it was real, and it was draining the life from his girl. He tried to pull the blanket, but Sophia was too tightly wrapped. He growled at the ceiling, at the walls, at the nothingness that was killing him. His dark eyes fixed on Sophia's pale face, and an unthinkable determination, transcending any training, ignited in them. He needed to be more drastic. He needed to be uncontrollable. With a new surge of energy, Max positioned himself at the edge of the bed close to Sophia. He grabbed the loose fabric of her pajama top with his teeth, not to hurt, but to pull, to drag with all the strength he had left. He pulled, growling, using his body weight for leverage, his muscles coiling in a supreme effort. Sophia felt a violent tug. It wasn't Max's gentle touch, nor his familiar nudge. It was a brute, sudden force that shook her. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy and clouded, to see Max's face inches from hers, his teeth firmly clamped onto her clothing, his eyes wide with terror and urgency. She felt herself falling. A silent scream escaped her throat as she was pulled off the bed, landing with a dull thud on the cold cabin floor. The fall was a brutal shock, jolting her from the lethargy of the poisoning. Her head throbbed, and the blurred vision of Max, still growling and pulling, was the only thing she could focus on. "Max, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice hoarse and weak, more angry than scared. She tried to push him away, but her arms felt like lead, heavy and useless. Max didn't let go. He continued to pull, now away from the bed towards the bedroom door, his low, incessant growl filling the deadly silence. Sophia was awake, but the danger was still there, invisible, and now she was on the floor, dizzy and confused, with her guide dog acting in a way she'd never seen before, a way that seemed insane. He was trying to save her, but she didn't know yet. The fall was a brutal shock, jolting Sophia from the lethargy of the poisoning, but it didn't fully release her from its grip. Her head throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, and the vision of Max, still growling and pulling her top, was the only thing she could focus on amidst the fog blurring her thoughts. "Max!" She tried to push him away, but her arms felt like lead. Heavy and powerless, the wooden floor beneath her was cold, a sensation that should have been invigorating, but which only intensified the chill that ran through her body. Max didn't let go. He continued to pull, now away from the bed, towards the bedroom door, his low, incessant growl filling the deadly silence that for her was merely the absence of sound, but for him was the silent scream of an invisible predator. His dark eyes, previously filled with dread, now radiated an almost wild determination, an urgency that transcended any training. With each tug, Sophia felt weaker. Her initial anger began to give way to a growing sense of panic. Max had never, ever acted this way. His movements were abrupt, without the gentleness of a trained guide dog. He was in a panic, but why? She tried to sit up, but the world spun violently. Cold nausea rose in her throat. It wasn't just sleep. It wasn't just the shock of the fall. There was something more, something profoundly wrong. The air, previously just silent, now felt dense, heavy, almost suffocating. She couldn't hear, but she could feel the oppression. Max growled again, a sound that seemed to tear his own throat. He stumbled, his hind legs almost giving out, but he recovered, pulling with renewed vigor. He dragged Sophia a few inches, then a few more, her body sliding awkwardly across the wooden floor. Sophia's pajama top was stretched taut and almost tearing under the force of Max's jaw. "Max, stop, you're hurting me," she tried to shout, but her voice was a hoarse whisper. The words seemed to dissolve in the heavy air before they were even formed. She tried to push his head away, but her hands were weak and uncoordinated. Max's eyes met hers. There was no madness, just deep pain and a desperate plea. He seemed to be pleading for her to understand, to trust him. In that moment, something clicked in Sophia's clouded mind. It wasn't the Max she knew, but it was the Max who was protecting her. The urgency in his eyes, the way he fought against his own weakness, the unwavering way he pulled her towards the door, all of it began to paint a terrible picture. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the familiar quietness of her world, but a menacing silence, an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. She felt a pang of cold fear. Max wasn't being disobedient, he was terrified, and he was trying to get her out of there. With a final effort, Max pulled her, and Sophia felt the impact of her head against the bedroom doorframe. The pain was sharp, but the proximity of the exit ignited a spark of hope and terror. They were at the door. Max released her top for an instant, panting heavily, before nudging his snout against Sophia's hand, then against the cold doorknob. His bloodshot eyes fixed on her, pleading. The message was clear, even without sound. Open. Get out. Now. Sophia looked at the doorknob, then at Max, who now seemed to be struggling to stay on his feet. Time was running out, and the cold, brutal truth finally dawned on her. They were in danger, and Max was the only thing between her and oblivion. The cold, brutal truth finally dawned on Sophia, tearing through the fog of poisoning. They were in danger. Her hazy eyes fixed on the doorknob, then on Max's face, who now seemed to struggle to stay on his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion and urgency. He no longer pleaded, he demanded with every fiber of his being that she act. Sophia's hand moved slowly, as if submerged in thick water. Every muscle protested, every nerve fiber seemed numb. The wooden floor beneath her seemed to sway, and the air, previously just heavy, now burned in her lungs, a dry, irritating sensation. She felt herself floating, and reality seemed a distant dream, but the image of Max, so desperate, so determined, was a beacon in the growing darkness. With a Herculean effort, she extended her arm, her fingers tingling as they touched the cold metal of the doorknob. It was heavier than she remembered, more resistant. She tried to turn it, but her strength was minimal. The world spun again, and she felt the bitter taste of vomit rising in her throat. Max, sensing her weakness, nudged his snout against her hand, then against the doorknob, as if trying to help her turn it. He growled, a hoarse, painful sound, and then, with a final surge of energy, he rose slightly, bracing his front paws against the door beside Sophia, and pushed with his body. It wasn't the strength of a guide dog, but the strength of a primal protector. The impact, combined with Max's weight and the pressure of Sophia's hand, made the doorknob yield with a soft click. The door swung open with a lazy creak, revealing the darkness of the hallway. A gust of colder air, though still stale, seemed to hit Sophia's face. It wasn't the fresh air she expected, but it was a change, a faint promise of respite. She tried to drag herself out of the room, but her limbs wouldn't respond. She was trapped, her body too heavy to move. Max, however, didn't stop. He released her top and, with an incredible effort, nudged his snout under Sophia's shoulder, trying to force her to roll out of the room. He used his body like a plow, pushing and dragging, whimpering softly with each movement. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath ragged, but he didn't give up. Sophia felt herself slide out of the room, her body rolling awkwardly into the hallway. The floor was equally cold, but the open space was a small victory. She was out of the room, but where to go? The entire cabin seemed to be immersed in the same deadly quiet, the same heavy, suffocating air. Max fell to his knees for an instant, his body trembling, but rose again, the determination in his eyes stronger than the weakness in his paws. He turned, dragging himself in front of Sophia, and began to pull again, this time by the sleeve of her pajamas, in a clear direction, the living room, where the large windows and main door were located. Every inch was a battle. Sophia felt as if she were moving through a dream, where each step required monumental effort. Her vision was blurred, the edges of the hallway seemed to ripple, and a sharp throbbing pain settled in her temples. She could feel her own body failing, her muscles refusing to obey. "Max, I can't," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, a tenuous thread of sound that was lost in the oppressive silence. But Max didn't hear her, or if he did, it didn't matter. He knew there was no time to give up. He continued to pull, dragging her with a strength that seemed to come from a place beyond physical exhaustion. He was a guardian, a warrior, and his mission was clear: to get his girl out of that silent trap. He stumbled again, almost falling, but recovered, his eyes fixed on the living room door, a desperate goal amidst the deadly fog that enveloped them. The cabin was closing in on them, and time was running out rapidly. The hallway stretched before them, a tunnel of deepening shadows and suffocating air. Max, his body trembling with effort, dug his paws into the wooden floor, pulling Sophia, agonizing inch by agonizing inch. Each gasp of air was a harsh hiss, each muscle tremor a testament to his fading strength. Yet his grip on her pajama sleeve remained unwavering, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. Sophia, a dead weight, felt less like she was being pulled and more like she was dissolving. The floorboards beneath her seemed to undulate, and the hallway walls distorted into grotesque shapes. Her head throbbed with a relentless rhythm, a drumbeat of impending doom. The air, previously merely heavy, now felt like liquid fire in her lungs. Each breath a struggle against an invisible current. She tasted blood and bile, a metallic tang coating her tongue. Her vision, already blurred, began to narrow, focusing only on Max's frantic, bloodshot eyes, her anchor in a world spinning out of control. "Max," she whispered again, a sound so faint it was swallowed by the silence. Her arm, where he held her, was numb, the fabric of her sleeve tearing further with each desperate tug. She wanted to help, to push, to crawl, but her limbs were like lead, unresponsive. It was as if her consciousness had detached, floating above her failing body, observing the grim ballet of survival. Max, sensing her responsiveness wane, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure frustration and fear. He paused for a fraction of a second, nuzzling his damp snout against her face, then licking her cheek frantically, as if trying to shock her back to full consciousness. When she responded with no more than a faint moan, He resumed his desperate tug, his movements more erratic, driven by an instinct that screamed, "Faster, faster." They passed the closed bathroom door, then the guest room, each landmark a small victory, but each step closer to a finish line that seemed impossibly distant. The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, pressing down on Sophia, stealing the last vestiges of strength from her muscles. Cold sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and a shiver not of cold, but of a deep internal chill ran through her body. She felt a profound weariness, a desire to simply close her eyes and succumb to the silent embrace of unconsciousness. But Max wouldn't let her. With a final, monumental effort, Max pulled Sophia past the threshold of the living room. The larger space offered a deceptive sense of relief. The air here was no less toxic, but the sight of the large bay window, faintly visible through the gloom, ignited a desperate glimmer of hope in Sophia's fading mind. The main door, a heavy oak slab, stood resolute against the farthest wall. Salvation was there, tantalizingly close, but still out of reach. Max released her sleeve, panting heavily, his flanks heaving. He stumbled, falling momentarily onto his front paws, his head low, almost touching the floor. For a terrifying second, Sophia thought he had given up, that his own body had finally betrayed him. But then, with a new surge of adrenaline, he rose, shaking his head violently as if to clear a fog. His eyes, now almost completely red, fixed on the window. He nuzzled his snout against her shoulder, then her head, trying to guide her towards the glass. When she remained almost inert, he began to bark, a series of short, sharp barks, unlike any sound she had ever heard from him. They weren't the playful barks of a happy dog, nor the warning barks of a guard dog. They were cries of pure, unadulterated terror and urgency, a desperate plea for her to see, for her to understand. Sophia, though she couldn't hear the sound, felt the vibrations against her chest, a rapid, frantic rhythm that echoed her own frantic heartbeat. She saw the intensity in his jaw, the tense muscles in his throat. He was telling her something, something vital. Window, open, air. Max, seeing her glazed eyes, changed tactics. He began to push her, not pulling, but using his entire body. He wedged his head under her armpit, then under her back, trying to make her roll, to propel her across the floor towards the window. It was slow, arduous work, each movement a Herculean effort for the weakening dog. Sophia's body scraped against the wooden floor, the friction a dull ache she barely registered. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the air growing denser, more suffocating with each passing second. Sophia's vision dimmed further, the edges of her consciousness fraying. She felt a cold numbness spreading through her limbs, a terrifying lethargy that threatened to drag her completely under. Max, his breath now coming in ragged gasps, stumbled again, but recovered, his unwavering resolve. He knew with an instinct far deeper than training that this was their last chance. He had to get her to that window, and time was running out rapidly. Sophia was now inches from the window, a grey, distorted blur in her hazy vision. The cold from the glass radiated, a strange contrast to the feverish heat consuming her from within. The headache was a constant hammer, and nausea, a wave threatening to engulf her. She felt Max nudging his snout against her inert hand, then against her arm, trying to make her rise. But her body was a lead anchor, too heavy to lift. Max, with a growl of frustration that was barely audible, released her and turned to the window. It was an old, heavy wooden frame with a dark metal latch in the center. For a dog, the mechanism was an insurmountable barrier. But Max was no ordinary dog. He jumped, bracing his front paws on the sill, his body trembling with effort. His eyes, now almost completely bloodshot, fixed on the latch. He tried to push it with his snout, then with his paw, but the metal was smooth and resistant. Sophia, through the fog obscuring her mind, saw Max struggling. She felt the vibrations of his frantic movements against the floor. Her mind, in a flash of desperate clarity, tried to decipher his actions. Open. He wants to open. But the words were just thoughts, unable to manifest into action. Max recoiled for an instant, panting. The heavy air in the room was affecting him too. His movements were slower, less coordinated. But his determination didn't waver. He observed the latch again, his eyes fixed on the details of the mechanism. Then, with a maneuver that defied his canine nature, he jumped again. But this time, instead of pushing, he used his jaw. With surprising precision, he bit the latch lever, not to crush it, but to grip it. With an upward tug, followed by a twist of his head, he succeeded. A metallic click, muffled by the dense air, echoed. The latch was open. A small victory, but the window remained closed. Max tried to push it with his snout, then with his paw, but the wood was swollen and stuck. He scratched at the glass, the sharp scraping sounds sending shivers down Sophia's spine, even through her numbness. He barked again, the muffled hoarse barks vibrating through Sophia's body, an urgent message that they were so close. Sophia, sensing the urgency, tried to move. She reached out, her fingers tingling, and touched the cold glass. Her vision cleared for an instant, and she saw the open latch, proof of Max's intelligence. "Max, the window," she mumbled, her voice a ghostly whisper. Max, noticing her gaze, turned back to her. He nudged his snout against her hand, then against the window again, as if asking for help. But Sophia was at her limit. Her vision began to dim at the edges, and the sound of her own heart seemed to fade. She felt the cold rising through her limbs, a sensation of numbness that threatened to drag her into total unconsciousness. Max let out a low, desperate growl. He knew he couldn't wait. With a new surge of energy, he backed up a few steps, his muscles tense. He looked at the window, then at Sophia, a terrible and final decision to be made. He couldn't open it with his paws. He couldn't push it with his snout. With a guttural howl that seemed to tear his throat, Max charged. He didn't throw himself against the glass, but against the wooden frame, where the glass met the wall. He slammed his shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times, with all the strength he had left. Each impact was a violent tremor in the silent cabin, an echo of desperation and pure brute force. The wood groaned, a dry crack followed by another, and then a loud, prolonged creak. The window frame yielded slightly. A thread of cold, fresh, glorious air permeated the room. It wasn't a gust, but a breath, a promise. Sophia felt it, a light breeze on her feverish skin, and a sigh escaped her lips. But the air was still limited, and the window was not yet fully open. Max, exhausted, collapsed onto his paws, his body trembling uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on the narrow crack, knowing it still wasn't enough. Time was running out, and the fresh air, though present, seemed like a distant mirage. Max collapsed heavily onto his paws, his body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle protesting. His eyes, now almost completely bloodshot, fixed on the narrow crack, a thread of fresh air that seemed like a mirage. It wasn't enough. Sophia, inches from the glass, felt the cold breath on her feverish skin, a momentary relief that quickly faded, swallowed by the fog consuming her mind. Her consciousness was now a candle about to gutter out, flickering on the threshold of total darkness. Max let out a low growl, more a whimper of exhaustion than a growl. He knew there had to be more. The window, though slightly yielded, remained stubbornly stuck. The glass, though scratched, was intact, and the wooden frame, now splintered and cracked, still held most of the opening firmly. He tried to push with his snout again, a weak, strengthless movement. The wood didn't budge. His eyes, in a flash of desperate intelligence, scanned the floor for something, anything he could use. There was nothing. The cabin was cluttered, but nothing a dog could manipulate. He looked back at the window, at the cracked frame where the impact of his shoulder had made a difference. There was a loose sliver of wood, a sharp splinter protruding from the frame. With a new surge of adrenaline, Max rose, swaying slightly. He approached the crack, his snout exploring the splintered wood. With surprising precision, he bit the tip of the splinter, not to chew, but to grip it. With a tug, using his body weight and the strength of his jaw, he tried to pry the splinter free. The wood groaned again, a muffled sound of protest. Sophia felt the vibrations against the floor, a rhythmic tremor that echoed her own faint pulse. In her hazy vision, she saw the silhouette of Max, a dark, frantic shape against the gloom. She smelled the fresh air, now a little stronger, but still insufficient to ward off the drowsiness enveloping her. The headache was a constant throb, and her body seemed to float in a cold void. Max pulled again, his neck muscles taut, his hind paws dragging across the floor. A dry crack, louder this time, echoed through the room. The splinter of wood came free, taking a larger piece of the frame with it. With the splinter came an opening. Not a complete opening, but a larger, jagged, torn hole in the wood. With the splinter removed, the tension in the window frame eased. The glass, though still held at the top, yielded slightly at the bottom, creating a larger, more jagged opening. A stream of fresh, cold, invigorating air flooded the room. It wasn't a gust, but a constant breath, a life-giving exhalation that spread through the heavy air. Max released the splinter of wood, which fell to the floor with a dull thud. He recoiled, panting heavily, his tongue lolling, his flanks heaving at a frantic pace. He was barely able to stand, but his eyes, though tired, shone with a wild satisfaction. He had done it. Sophia felt the cold air kiss her face, entering her lungs with an urgency that made her cough weakly. The cough, a hoarse, dry sound, was like an electric shock. She opened her eyes, which had previously been almost closed. Her vision was still blurred, but the darkness at the edges receded slightly. She saw the jagged opening in the window, the fresh air streaming in, and Max standing a few feet away, trembling. The clean air was like a balm for her poisoned body. The headache, though still present, lessened somewhat, and nausea receded to a distant hum. She took a deep, ragged, but conscious breath. Her heart, which had previously seemed to beat at a slow, heavy rhythm, began to quicken slightly, propelled by the oxygen. Max, seeing the signs of life in Sophia, let out a low whimper and dragged himself to her. He nuzzled his damp snout against her hand, then licked it gently, a familiar touch that anchored her to reality. She felt his rough tongue, the warmth of his body. "Max," she whispered, her voice still weak, but with a clarity she hadn't possessed before. The dog lay down beside her, his head on her thigh, exhausted but vigilant. The fresh forest air filled the room, washing away the invisible poison, bringing with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Salvation was there within reach, but Sophia was still weak, and Max, though victorious, was at his limit, his body paying the price for his monumental effort. The immediate danger had been averted, but the fight for recovery was only just beginning. The cold, invigorating air streaming through the torn window was a blessing, an icy kiss that slowly dissipated the fog imprisoning Sophia's mind. The weak cough that racked her was a reflex, a spasm of the body reacting to the oxygen refilling her lungs. She opened her eyes, blinking against the gloom. The darkness at the edges of her field of vision receded, but the world still seemed distorted, as if she were looking through a fishbowl. Max lay beside her, his head heavy on her thigh, his body trembling slightly with effort and exhaustion. He let out a low whimper, a sound Sophia didn't hear, but felt as a soft vibration through her skin. His rough tongue brushed her hand, a familiar touch that pulled her further into reality. "Max," she whispered again, her voice a thread, but with growing conviction. She tried to move her fingers and felt a prickle of tingling. The sensation was unpleasant, but it was a sign of life. Slowly, painfully, clarity began to seep in. The image of the shattered window, the jagged hole in the wood, The memory of Max's impacts against the frame, and before that his struggle, his desperate barks she couldn't hear, his tugs on her collar. A mental image formed, Max trying to open it, biting the latch, slamming his shoulder against it, all of it to bring her back. She looked at the wood-burning stove, which now seemed a sinister presence in the corner of the room. Invisible smoke, an imperceptible scent to her dulled nose, but the cause of her agony, carbon monoxide. Max had known, he had sensed it. Her headache still hammered, but with less intensity, a steady rhythm instead of a suffocating burst. Nausea receded to a distant hum in her stomach. The cold of the cabin, previously a numbness, now felt invigorating. She tried to lift her head. Her neck muscles protested, weak and sore. Max felt her movement and lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes fixed on her, a mixture of relief and vigilance. He nudged his snout against the side of her face, a gentle invitation to rise. Sophia felt the urgency. They couldn't stay there. The cabin was still dangerous, even with the air coming in. The source of the poison was still there, and the night's cold would become a problem with the window open. She needed to get out. With a monumental effort, Sophia began to try to sit up. First, she rolled onto her side, pushing herself up with a trembling arm. The cabin spun for an instant, and she closed her eyes, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Max, sensing her struggle, moved slightly, positioning himself so she could lean on him. She felt the warmth of his body, the firmness of his muscles, and used him as a brace, slowly pushing herself up. Her limbs felt like sandbags, heavy and unyielding. Finally, with a muffled groan, she managed to sit up, leaning against the wall, gasping for breath. The world around her still felt unstable, but mental clarity was rapidly returning. She looked at Max, who was sitting beside her, his body still trembling, but his posture alert. His eyes, though tired, shone with an intelligence that transcended any training. He had saved her. In a way she never could have imagined, he had pulled her back from the brink of death. She reached out, her fingers still tingling, and stroked his head. "Good boy," she whispered, and felt warm tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief and profound gratitude. Max licked her hand again, a soft, comforting touch. He knew she needed more than just fresh air. She needed to get out. But the cabin door seemed miles away, and her feet felt incapable of carrying her there. Sophia looked at the door, then at Max. A new challenge presented itself, as daunting as the last. Immediate salvation had been achieved, but the journey to complete safety was still ahead. She was weak, exhausted, but Max's unwavering determination had ignited a spark of strength within her. She would move. She would get out, even if she had to crawl. Carbon monoxide. Max had known. He had sensed it. She tried to lift her head. Sophia felt the urgency. She needed to get out. He had saved her. She needed to get out. With a gentle, yet determined tug on her shirt, he urged her to move. His eyes fixed on the cabin door. The door seemed miles away, and her feet felt incapable of carrying her there. She would move. She would get out. The door, previously a portal to safety, now seemed the entrance to a labyrinth meters away, but an insurmountable distance for her heavy limbs. Sophia inhaled deeply, the icy air tearing at her throat, a vivid reminder of the danger that still lurked and the intensifying cold. Max, as if reading her thoughts, let out a low, soft whimper, then tugged her shirt again, an irresistible invitation. "Yes, Max," she whispered, her voice still raspy. "We have to go." Her first attempt to stand was a painful failure. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen back if Max hadn't been there, firm as a rock, his body serving as a brace. She felt his strength, his patience, and his unwavering determination. With renewed effort, leaning on him, she managed to get to her knees, the world spinning like a wild top. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and waited for the dizziness to pass. Max remained quiet, his body tense, ready for her every move. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Sophia began to crawl. Each movement was a battle against weakness and persistent nausea. Her arms trembled, her knees ached against the cold wooden floor. Max crawled beside her, his snout near her hand, a constant support, an anchor in her clouded mind. When she paused, exhausted, he gave a gentle nudge with his nose, a soft reminder that they couldn't give up. The distance to the door seemed to lengthen with every meter they advanced. Cold sweat streamed down her forehead, and her vision continued to fail at the edges. But the image of Max, his eyes fixed on her, his unwavering presence was the beacon guiding her through the darkness. He wasn't just guiding her, he was carrying a part of her weight, not physically, but with his sheer willpower. Finally, after what seemed like hours but were only agonizing minutes, they reached the door. The cold wood against her hand was a relief, a landmark. But the doorknob was too high for her to reach from her knees, and her legs felt unable to support her. Max, sensing her dilemma, began to push the door with his snout, trying to open it. It was merely ajar, not locked, but it was still an obstacle. He growled, his frustration palpable. Sophia made one last effort. With Max's help, nudging her hip with his head, she managed to brace herself against the doorframe, pulling herself up. The pain in her muscles was excruciating, but the adrenaline and the fear of remaining there propelled her. With a trembling hand, she reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open to the darkness of the night. The air that rushed in was an icy slap, sharp, yet incredibly clean. The gust of fresh air hit her like a shock, rousing her further, but the cold was intense. Outside, the forest was a dark, impenetrable mass, dotted only by the distant gleam of stars. The temperature was glacial, and the ground was covered by a thin layer of frost. Sophia stumbled out, Max by her side, his body pushing her forward. The icy air seemed to burn her lungs, but it was a balm compared to the silent poison she had been inhaling. She felt the hard, frozen ground under her feet, the frozen grass pricking her skin. They were out, they were alive, but safety was a distant mirage. They were in the middle of nowhere, in the heart of the icy night, and Sophia was still weak and disoriented. Max looked at her, then at the darkness of the forest, his eyes gleaming with a new urgency. The danger of the cabin had been overcome, but the cold, the darkness, and the solitude of the forest presented a different, perhaps even more daunting challenge. Max's survival instinct, which had led her this far, now pointed to the next step, to the next barrier to be overcome. The journey to true safety was only just beginning. They were out. They were alive. Sophia stumbled, her leg muscles protesting violently. Each step was a feat, her knees threatening to buckle at any moment. Max was there, his sturdy body a constant support, a warm wall against which she could lean. He didn't pull her collar with the desperate force of before, but with a firm, directional pressure, guiding her forward into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. The night's cold bit, and Sophia felt her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The thin clothing she wore offered no protection against the icy embrace of dawn. Carbon monoxide had weakened her, but the cold now threatened to steal what little warmth she had left. She looked ahead, but the darkness was absolute. A black veil that swallowed any glimmer of light, save for the distant sparkle of stars barely piercing the dense tree canopy. The scent of pine and damp earth was strong, but there were no signs of a path, a road, or any indication of civilization. The forest seemed endless, a silent, menacing labyrinth. Max, however, seemed to know where to go. His snout was low, sniffing the frozen ground, his ears swiveling, picking up sounds Sophia couldn't hear. The rustle of dry leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of some nocturnal animal. He didn't hesitate, his tail low, but his posture determined. Sophia tripped on a protruding root, almost falling, but Max held her steady. He let out a low whimper, a sound of concern, and licked her hand as if to encourage her. "I'm okay, Max," she whispered, her voice raspy from the cold and exhaustion. The truth was, she wasn't. Nausea returned in waves, and her headache pulsed with the intensity of a drum. But her faith in Max was absolute. He had saved her from the invisible. He would save her from the unknown. Each step was a silent prayer that her strength wouldn't abandon her. Her feet were numb, her fingers stiff. She felt her body dangerously chilling, hypothermia beginning its insidious work. The forest was a silent monster, and they were small and vulnerable. Suddenly Max stopped. His muscles tensed, and he raised his head, sniffing the air with renewed intensity. It wasn't the smell of the forest nor the smell of fear. There was something more. A faint scent, almost imperceptible to a human, but to his keen nose it was a promise. He whipped his head sharply to the right, tugging Sophia's collar with renewed force, but this time it wasn't panic, it was purpose. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on a point invisible to Sophia. He wasn't guiding blindly, he was following something. A trail. A hope. Sophia felt the change in his posture. The urgency was different now, more focused, less desperate. "What is it, Max?" she thought, her mind still clouded, but curiosity pricking at her. He let out a soft bark, almost inaudible, but laden with meaning. It was a sound of discovery, of direction. He pulled again, and Sophia, without questioning, followed. The darkness remained dense, the cold biting, but there was now a new sense of direction, a new hope, guided by the supernatural instinct of her dog. Where Max was leading her, she didn't know, but she trusted him with her life as he had trusted her with his. The journey to safety was far from over. But a new path had been revealed, a path that only Max could see, feel, and smell in the vastness of the night. Max pulled her with a renewed urgency, but now it was a guided urgency, not a desperate one. Suddenly, Max stopped. There was something more, a trail, a hope, and then, through the impenetrable curtain of trees, Sophia caught a glimmer, a faint, yellowish light, intermittent, like a distant blink. It wasn't a star, it was too low and flickering. It was a point of light, a patch of warmth in the icy darkness. Max stopped again, turning his head towards the light, his eyes fixed. He let out a low whimper, almost a sob of relief and contained excitement. He tugged Sophia's collar with more force, not to rush her, but to lead her in the right direction. "A light, Max," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It was a beacon, a promise in a sea of darkness. Hypothermia was stealing the sensation from her fingers and toes, her peripheral vision dimming. But that light, that small point of hope, was what she needed. Max began to move again, with an even more intense purpose, almost running, his tail wagging softly. He had found something. They weren't alone. The light was distant, but it was real. It was proof that Max's intelligence and love had, once again, overcome the impossible. The journey was still perilous, but the absolute darkness had been broken. Max pulled with an urgency Sophia could barely match. The light, previously a mere glimmer, now flickered with more definition through the impenetrable curtain of trees. Each step was a battle against gravity and her own body. Her leg muscles, already aching and trembling, seemed ready to give out under the weight of exhaustion and cold. The icy air cut at her throat with each breath, and her lungs burned, turning the act of breathing into a silent torture. Max, however, seemed immune to weariness. His tail, previously low and cautious, now wagged at a faster pace, and his gait had a lightness that contrasted with Sophia's sluggishness. He didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the golden point that grew increasingly sharp. The scent he had detected, A mix of wood smoke and something metallic guided him like an invisible beacon through the darkness. As they drew closer, the light revealed itself. It wasn't a large, inviting house, nor a crackling bonfire. It was a small, rustic cabin, little more than a shack, with a single window from which a faint, yellowish glow emanated. A crude, irregular stone chimney released a lazy wisp of smoke into the night sky, which was subtly beginning to lighten on the horizon. It seemed abandoned, or perhaps just uninhabited at the moment. But there was warmth, there was light, there was hope, a promise of refuge. Sophia felt a sob of relief rise in her throat, but her weakness was so profound she could barely utter a sound. Her knees buckled for a moment, and she would have fallen if Max hadn't stopped abruptly, his sturdy body serving as a brace. He turned his head and licked her hand, his dark eyes filled with an almost human concern. He knew she was at her limit, that her endurance was draining with every heartbeat. With a gentle yet determined tug, Max encouraged her to continue the last few feet. The cabin door, made of dark, weather-beaten wooden planks, was ajar, revealing more of the light and a promise of refuge. The scent of wood smoke was now strong and comforting, a balm to her dulled senses. Max nudged the door open with his snout, just enough for them to enter. The interior was small, a single compartment with a rustic fireplace where a few embers still glowed, emitting warmth and light. There was a simple cot, a crude table, and some hunting tools hanging on the walls. No one was there. It was empty. Sophia stumbled inside, her vision dimming at the edges. The warmth was a welcome shock to her frozen body, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. Max let out a low whimper, gently pushing her towards the cot. She collapsed onto it, her limbs heavy and numb. The world spun, and the last reserves of consciousness rapidly drained away. Max, however, didn't rest. He sniffed the air intensely, his muscles tense. There was a strange, subtle scent, mixed with the wood smoke and the cabin's mustiness. It wasn't carbon monoxide, but something else, something animal, wild and cautious. He looked at the ajar door, then at Sophia, who was already fading into a forced sleep from hypothermia and exhaustion, her breathing shallow and ragged. Max's protective instinct, which had already driven him to unthinkable acts, ignited again. He knew they weren't entirely safe. The cabin offered shelter, yes, but the forest was still out there, and the scent he had detected was a warning. He needed to protect Sophia, even if she was unconscious and vulnerable. With one last look at his girl, Max turned and with a low, determined growl, pushed the wooden door shut, locking out whatever might be outside. He then lay down next to the cot, his warm body pressed against Sophia's, his eyes fixed on the door, watching, his supernatural instinct on high alert. The journey to safety had found a pause, but the fight for survival was not yet over. Max lay down next to the cot. The strange animal scent persisted in the air, a constant reminder that the cabin, though a refuge, was not impenetrable. His dark eyes scanned the wooden door, then the single window, and finally rested on Sophia. She was pale, her lips purplish, her breathing so shallow that the movement of her chest was barely visible. The uncontrollable shivering had ceased, replaced by a worrisome stillness. Hypothermia was doing its insidious work, stealing her warmth and her life. Max let out a low, almost inaudible whimper of anguish. He couldn't warm her enough, couldn't give her food or water. His intelligence, which had led him to unprecedented acts of heroism, now struggled against helplessness. He knew that time was an enemy, as relentless as carbon monoxide or the forest's cold. The hours dragged on in a silent vigil. Outside, the sounds of the night were muffled, but Max was on high alert. The rustle of dry leaves, the snap of a twig under an unseen weight, the distant howl echoing in the darkness. Each of them made his muscles tense, his body poised for action. He growled softly a few times, a silent warning to any intruder who dared approach. His tail was low, still, but his senses were sharp, picking up every vibration, every scent. Finally, a pale grey light began to filter through the window. Dawn. The air in the cabin was icy, but the wisp of smoke from the chimney still rose, a small flag of hope. Max looked at Sophia. She was colder, her skin marbled, her breathing even weaker. He knew they couldn't wait any longer. With a renewed determination, Max rose. He gave a soft lick to Sophia's face, a final silent farewell to her stillness. Then he turned to the door. He couldn't leave her alone. But he also couldn't stay still. His mission wasn't complete. He nudged the door open with his snout, just enough to poke his head out. The dawn air was biting, but the faint light revealed the forest, still shrouded in mist, but less menacing than in total darkness. Max looked at the sky, then at the ground. He needed to attract attention somehow to that small point of smoke and warmth. He stepped back, positioning himself in the center of the cabin, and then, with all the strength in his lungs, let out a bark. It wasn't a bark of panic nor of anger. It was a bark of distress, deep and resonant, echoing through the trees. He barked again and again, each bark a desperate plea, a supplication to the universe. Sophia couldn't hear him, but he hoped someone else could. His persistent and unusually loud barking for the forest's silence, combined with the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. For miles, the forest was an uninhabited vastness, but luck, or fate, or Max's supernatural instinct was on their side. A few miles away, a forest ranger on his morning rounds stopped his vehicle. There was a strange sound, a continuous barking that seemed to come from an unusual direction, and looking at the horizon, he noticed a small plume of smoke, almost invisible, but there. There were no registered cabins in that area. Curiosity and experience told him something was wrong. Back at the cabin, Max continued to bark, his throat burning but unyielding. His ears swiveled, and suddenly he picked up a sound. Faint, distant but unmistakable. The engine of a vehicle. It was approaching. He stopped barking, his eyes fixed on the door. The sound grew louder, clearer. He let out a low whimper of excitement, wagging his tail vigorously. His intelligence, his love, his determination, all had culminated in this moment. Minutes later, a sturdy man, dressed in a forest ranger's uniform, appeared at the cabin's entrance. He paused, surprised to see the Labrador, who looked exhausted but radiant, and the unconscious girl on the cot. "My God!" he exclaimed, rushing to Sophia. Max approached the forest ranger, his tail wagging vigorously, licking the man's hand, as if to say, "She's safe now, I did it." Sophia was airlifted to the nearest hospital. Her recovery was long and difficult, marked by weeks of intensive care and physical therapy. But she recovered. And with every step of her recovery, Max was there, his warm, faithful body, his eyes filled with unwavering devotion. When Sophia finally returned home, the cabin in the forest and the carbon monoxide were just a distant memory, a nightmare she could barely recall. But the image of Max, her four-legged hero, was etched forever in her heart. He had saved her from an invisible danger, guided her through the darkness, and called for help when she couldn't. Max wasn't just a guide dog, he was her soulmate, her guardian angel. His intelligence, his courage, and his love had transcended the limits of what was expected of an animal, revealing a supernatural instinct for protection that defied human comprehension. And from that day on, Sophia knew that as long as Max was by her side, she would always be safe. The fight was over. They had won.